The war in Ukraine has raged on for over 4 years and is the bloodiest conflict Russia has seen since World War II. But it's not just humans that have been lost in the battle, it's machines too, specifically Russian tanks. The numbers here are genuinely staggering, but they also come with a big asterisk since sources vary. The most conservative, defensible figures belong to Oryx, the open-source intelligence project that counts only losses it can verify with a photograph or a video. Thus, Oryx has confirmed somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,400 Russian tanks destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured between February 2022 and June 2026. But after all that, Russia has been churning out replacements and may actually be on the verge of having more tanks in active service than before it started its so-called special military operation, according to some sources. That sounds like something which should make Kyiv nervous, and yet the dirty secret behind that growing fleet is that Russia can barely use it. Because in the time it took Moscow to rebuild its armored juggernaut, Ukraine quietly did something far more devastating than destroying tanks one by one. Ukraine changed the battlefield itself, and in doing so, turned the main battle tank, which had ruled ground warfare for a century, into something close to a liability. By comparison, Ukraine's confirmed tank losses sit at roughly 1,400, and Oryx itself suggests that this is a flaw, not a ceiling, because again, it only counts losses that it can verify with a photo or video. So the true number of vehicles destroyed may be significantly higher than the records. A secondary aggregator suggests that these accounts only display between 50 and 70% of actual Russian tank losses, which means the true number might be higher, plausibly in the range of 6,300 to 8,800 tanks. The Ukrainian General Staff, for its part, claims figures north of 10,000. While that number may be close to the reality, it's coming from a government that stands to gain from its enemies' dead machines, so treat it as the ceiling. But regardless of what numbers you take, at minimum, Russia has lost the equivalent of its entire pre-war active tank fleet, and probably closer to double that. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia went to war with roughly 3,000 tanks in active service, and probably had triple that in storage. And the institute calculated that in just the first 13 months of fighting, between February 2022 and March 2023, Russia lost nearly 1,900 of those active tanks. More than half the standing fleet was gone in little over a year. No army in the modern era has hemorrhaged armor at that rate. So how, after all of that, is Russia about to field more tanks than it started with? Well, the answer lies in that storage we mentioned. Most of the tanks in there were stockpiled from the Soviet Union era, where old units were just left with occasional maintenance. The IISS claimed that there could be 9,000 tanks in reserve, while some outlets suggested the number could very well have 5 figures. An OSINT researcher, Jompy, used satellite imagery of tank yards to count a more modest number of 7,342 tanks. And when the losses started piling up in 2023 and 2024, the Kremlin had a problem with simple arithmetic. Some experts claimed that Russia's only plant building genuinely new tanks from scratch, Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil, can produce only around 250 new modern T-90M tanks a year. The Omsk-Transmash plant can make another 150 T-80 BVMs, a modernized version of an older model. That's only 400 per year against the losses that averaged at least 85 per month. So Russia had to turn to those boneyards of thousands of old tanks from the Soviet Union. Every other so-called new tank reaching the front ended up not being new at all. It was an old Soviet hull, pulled from storage, stripped, refitted with fresh optics, radios, and reactive armor bolted onto the sides and pushed back into service. But here's where it gets almost absurd, and where you start to see Russian industry doing things that border on archaeology. As Russia worked through the easier candidates, it eventually reached the older tanks in the yards, around 1,000 T-72As dating from the early 1970s. These machines were so degraded that their engines were considered dead. So in September 2024, an industry representative told the State Duma's Defense Committee that Russian industry had launched a so-called new regeneration program, taking the old engines that powered these 45-ton tanks and rebuilding them with new internal parts, essentially resurrecting engines that had been written off as scrap. The catch was that this program was only expected to produce around 100 working engines, enough for about 10% of those stored T-72As. So, in December 2024, Russia doubled down, with the Kingisepp machine building plant in Leningrad Oblast signing a contract to refurbish a different, more powerful engine that also fits the T-72A. Russia was so determined to put 50-year-old tanks back on the road that it stood up an entire industrial effort to bring dead engines back to life. With fresh components, a 1970s T-72A could be brought up to something roughly resembling a modern T-72B3M, though never as well protected. The analyst Jompy has said that this was the moment he became convinced Russia intended to restore nearly its entire stored fleet, anything that was not completely rusted through. So let's actually do the tank math, because it's the spine of this whole story. As we mentioned, Russia started with roughly 3,000 active tanks. It lost somewhere around 4,400 confirmed, up to around 6,000. New production has added perhaps 1,600 tanks across the two most modern models, and the storage drawdown could have yielded around 5,000 recoverable hulls after you subtract the roughly 2,100 that were either rusted beyond saving or belonged to the old T-64 family. When you add all that up, the Russian ground forces could be fielding somewhere between 3,600 and 5,200 tanks, based on the lower limit of losses. That upper figure is almost twice the starting force. So on paper, Russia has rebuilt its armored force and made it bigger. But that same force is also, increasingly, comprised primarily of museum pieces. To understand why, we need to look exactly what kinds of tanks are in this fleet, because not all tanks are created equal, and Russia's lineup tells you everything about a military stretching backward through time to keep its formations full. Now let's start with the workhorse, the T-72. First rolling off Soviet lines in 1972, the T-72 was designed to be cheap, simple, rugged, and producible by the tens of thousands, the armored equivalent of the AK-47. And it's everywhere, being the most common tank on both sides of this war, as Ukraine inherited huge numbers of them too. The modern Russian frontline versions are the T-72B3 and the upgraded T-72B3M, with better fire control and reactive armor. But the T-72 is also the tank that turned into a global meme for catastrophic destruction. By Oryx's visually confirmed count, Russia has lost on the order of 1,800 T-72s, more than any other single type. The reasoning for that is baked into the tank's design, which we'll come back to later after we run through the other types. The second model is the T-80, which suffers from its own share of problems. Introduced in 1976, it was the world's first mass-produced tank powered by a gas turbine engine, the same basic principle as a helicopter or a jet, which made it blisteringly fast and quiet for its size, able to hit 40 miles an hour across open country. The Soviets and later Russians built roughly 5,400 to 5,500 of these tanks, with production extending until 2001. In Ukraine, the T-80 has been ground down relentlessly. By December 2024, open-source counts confirmed at least 1,000 T-80s destroyed, damaged, abandoned or captured, and some analysts argue Russia has effectively burned through its entire deployable T-80 fleet, though that stronger claim should be treated as an estimate rather than a settled fact. Russian commentators have suggested Moscow had committed around 90% of its available T-80s, funneling the survivors back to the Omsk plant in Siberia to be rebuilt into the latest T-80 BVM standard. Russian tank crews are said to have given the T-80 a grim nickname, the Steel Coffin, after watching too many of them lose their turrets in a single violent instant. At the top of the lineup sits the T-90, and specifically its most modern form, the T-90M Prorыв, which is the tank Russian President Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine likes to call one of the best in the world. The T-90 itself derived from the T-72, but layered with improvements, better gun and fire control system, relict reactive armor, the Sosna U gunner's sight, and a commander's panoramic sight that brings it closer to Western standards. It's the best tank Russia actually fights with. And yet, it's been dying in numbers that expose the entire problem. Oryx figures for June 2026 point to somewhere over 220 T-90 variants lost, with 155 of those being the T-90M. But there's another crucial piece of information that might be shocking. Russia is believed to have started the war with fewer than 70 T-90Ms. In 52 months, it's lost more than twice that many. So, those earlier figures suggesting the factory can output 250 of them in a year, possibly the result of the propaganda machine. And then, when even the T-72 stockpile started running thin, Russia was fully desperate. It went past the 1970s, past the 1960s, and pulled out the T-62, a tank that entered service in 1961, and the T-55, a design whose heritage extends back to the immediate post-war Soviet tank programs. These are antiques with thinner armor, less capable guns, and ammunition storage arrangements that are, if anything, even more dangerous than the newer tanks. Seeing T-55s rumble toward the front in the 2020s was, for many analysts, the single clearest signal that Russia was scraping the bottom of the barrel, trading away every advantage of quality for the brute reassurance of quantity. A tank from 1946 can still kill you, but it's not going to win you a modern war, and Russia knows it. Now, if you want more detailed analytics like these, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We post videos on everything important going on in the world. Now, all of this brings us to the crux of this entire story, the tank that was supposed to change everything and ended up being a flop, the T-14 Armata. When Russia first paraded the Armata through Red Square in 2015, it was billed as a revolution, a genuine next-generation tank with an unmanned turret, a protected crew capsule, an active protection system designed to shoot incoming missiles out of the air, and a design explicitly built to defeat the Western contemporaries. But in the largest tank war of the 21st century, where Russia has been desperate enough to deploy machines from 1946, the Armata has been almost completely absent. It made a brief cautious appearance in 2023, reportedly used only in a rear indirect fire role, and was withdrawn within the month. The official explanation was that the Armata was simply too expensive and that it made more sense to buy a larger number of cheaper vehicles. Reported unit costs run somewhere between $5 million and $9 million, far more than a T-72, T-80 or T-90, and because it's an entirely new platform, it couldn't even use the existing production lines. Now, it would be easy to mock the Armata as a parade prop, but there is a more interesting counter-argument worth taking seriously. In some ways, the T-14 is not really a design failure at all, but a casualty of timing, a superb tank delivered into a war that no longer rewards superb tanks. In an era where a $1,000 drone can disable a multi-million-dollar vehicle, pouring those millions into a single tank is basically suicidal. Which brings us to the crux of the issue. We've established that Russia has rebuilt a massive fleet of mostly Soviet-era tanks. So why, exactly, did all these tanks fail so catastrophically in the first place? The answer comes in three distinct layers. The first layer involves a vulnerability of the T-72 design that appears repeatedly in footage, even if you didn't know where you were looking at. A Russian tank is hit, there's a flash, and then the entire turret is hurled dozens of feet into the air. Soldiers and analysts call it the jack-in-the-box effect or the turret toss. This is a quirk of the tank's original engineering. Russian tanks like the T-72, T-80 and T-90 use an automatic loader instead of a human one, which lets them run with a smaller three-man crew and a lower, harder-to-hit profile. To feed that auto-loader, the tank stores its ammunition, around 20 ready rounds, in a carousel ring at the base of the turret, right in the center of the vehicle, which surrounds the crew compartment. When a penetrating hit reaches that ring, even one propellant charge can trigger a chain reaction that detonates the entire stockpile at once. The pressure has nowhere to go but up, blowing the turret clean off. The contrast with Western tanks is the part that really exposes the trade-off. A tank like the American M1 Abrams stores its ammunition in a separate compartment in the rear of the turret, sealed off from the crew by an armored door and fitted with blowout panels. When that ammunition is hit, the panels are designed to vent the explosion up and out, away from the crew compartment. The crew can and have survived ammunition fires that would have annihilated a Russian crew instantly. Now, the Soviet designers were not stupid. They made a deliberate choice, accepting a catastrophic failure mode in exchange for a smaller, lighter, cheaper tank that was easier to mass produce, easier to transport by rail, and harder to spot on the battlefield. For the kind of war Soviet planners imagined, a fast continental clash where individual tank survivability mattered less than overwhelming numbers, it was arguably a rational bargain. The problem is that this isn't that war. When you have scores of drones hovering right above the tank in one of the most surveilled front lines in history, that failure mode suddenly went from an occasional hit to a deliberate target. Now, the second layer of failure has nothing to do with the tanks and everything to do with how Russia used them. The clearest case study here is the opening drive on Kyiv. Russia sent long armored columns racing down predictable highways toward the capital, and those columns were chronically short of fuel and, more importantly, infantry. A tank, for all its armor and firepower, is effectively blind and deaf at close range. It has terrible visibility, especially to its sides and rear, and in forests, towns and villages, it's desperately vulnerable to anyone who can get close. The job of screening infantry is to find and flush out ambushes before they spring. The Modern War Institute drew the comparison with the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Just as Egyptian and Syrian infantry teams with wire-guided Saga missiles devastated unsupported Israeli tanks in 1973, small hidden teams of Ukrainian light infantry, armed with modern anti-tank missiles and drones, picked apart Russian columns that had no business advancing the way they did. The columns were forced onto roads because the surrounding terrain had become muddy and difficult to traverse. And this was dramatically illustrated by images of the infamous 35-mile-long convoy north of Kyiv. They bunched up into traffic jams, and then, because Russia didn't actually prepare for a drawn-out war, they ran out of fuel. It was a lesson in hubris, brought by the image of a 35-mile-long convoy of surrounded tanks. The third layer is the weapons. If you followed the early war, the tanks were stopped by the American Javelin and the British NLAW, shoulder-fired missiles that became viral symbols of Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine also fielded its own laser-guided Stugner P, but by 2025, some Ukrainian and independent assessments of drones credited them with roughly 65% of Russian tank losses. And that word drones is where the entire story hinges. According to Ukraine's own National Security and Defense Council, the country's defense industry reached the capacity to produce more than 8 million FPV drones a year by 2026, across more than 160 companies, ranging from large factories to garage startups. While this is a Ukrainian source, whatever the precise production figure, the order of magnitude means the front line is now saturated permanently with cheap flying bombs hunting anything that moves. And the implication for tanks is brutal. A tank no longer has to worry only about the ambush team it might stumble into. It has to worry about the sky constantly for every meter of every advance across the entire 1,100 kilometers of the front line. Russia and Ukraine both tried to fight back against the drones, of course, which resulted in some hilarious designs. The first countermeasure was electronic warfare, jammers that sever the radio link between the FPV drone and its pilot, sending it tumbling harmlessly to the ground. For a while, that worked until the drone makers started using fiber optics. Instead of a radio signal, these drones trailed an impossibly thin cable behind them, unspooling as they fly, which physically connected the drone to its pilot. Russia reportedly fielded these first in the spring of 2024, and Ukraine rapidly matched them. The cable soon littered the battlefield, becoming tangled in vegetation, infrastructure, and even bird nests. But despite that, the resulting fiber optics industry exploded, where reportedly China increased the prices between 250 and 400% in 2026. With electronic defenses failing, Russia turned to physical armor. It started in 2022 with what soldiers mockingly called cope cages, simple metal slat structures welded over the turret to catch grenades dropped by small drones. In early April 2024, turtle tanks emerged on the battlefield of the Russo-Ukrainian War, entire vehicles encased in welded sheet metal shells, so that the tank disappeared inside a crude metal box with just a gun poking out. In 2024, the Russians added hundreds of thick metal spines to these shells, betting that the resulting porcupine tanks would snag and detonate drones before they reached the hull. And by 2025, the spines had evolved into thousands of fine metal hairs, made from unwound aluminum cable draped over the vehicle like a shaggy coat. Some observers described them as hedgehogs, and they were among the most heavily protected seen during the war, capable of eating a dozen FPV drones before finally being knocked out. But they were still being knocked out. So what's the plan? What does Russia actually intend to do with this enormous horde of armor it can't deploy? The honest answer is that nobody outside the Kremlin knows for certain. The most likely explanation is that Russia is playing a long game. The thinking goes that Russian commanders are betting that some new counter-drone technology will emerge, a breakthrough in jamming, in interceptors, in directed energy, something that reopens the battlefield to fast, mobile, mechanized warfare. And in the meantime, they're preserving and rebuilding their armored core, keeping it intact and ready for that future moment when tanks can rule again. The darker, more immediate possibility is simpler. It suggests that Russian commanders, under pressure to deliver results, may simply get desperate enough to throw the tanks back into the fire, regardless of the consequences. And in that scenario, the vast rebuilt fleet is simply a reserve of expendable steel, fed into the battlefield to buy ground at a terrible rate of exchange. Remember, after 2022, Russia's advancement stalled to the point where, between 2023 and 2025, it occupied only about 1.23% of Ukraine's territory. And there is one final twist. The rebuilt fleet, for all its impressive size, is fundamentally a one-time boost. Russia dipped into the vast Soviet stockpile, and that stockpile is now nearly empty. A June 2026 satellite analysis by open-source analyst John P. revealed that while Russia started with a pre-war stockpile of 7,342 tanks, only 2,088 remain in storage, and of those, just 851 are viable for restoration. The remaining 1,237 tanks are effectively dead inventory. So Russia has drained something like 72% of its entire Cold War tank reserve. At this point, if losses continue at roughly 90 tanks per month, it will take another 9 months or so before the stock is fully out. And when that happens, there's no more waves of Soviet armor to use, and what Russia has will be based solely on what it can produce. And Russia's running out of more than just tanks, as the dominance of artillery on the battlefield is slowly being eroded. To learn more, check out this video and make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for daily news.